Welcome back to the Master's Apprentice, learning to be like Jesus. My name is Caleb,
My name is Dustin.
and we're excited to dive into another spiritual discipline. And Dustin, I know that we've been using the term spiritual discipline. One we probably haven't used as much in our conversations is practice, which is another term for the same thing: spiritual discipline, spiritual practice. And I didn't think about this till this week, and I realized that I actually prefer to use the word practice. Discipline's a great word for it. I tend to like to use the word practice because these spiritual tools are things that we're practicing at
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
hopes that they would become a discipline.
Right.
And so just I want to encourage you with that, if you've been staying with us and listening through this series, that we can also refer to them as spiritual practices, things that we are, by God's grace, working through, that we might be with him and be like him. And so today we're diving into the next spiritual practice or discipline, which is simplicity. Simplicity. And I don't know if that one might be a little more unfamiliar to some compared to the ones that we've already talked about. Don't you think, Dustin?
Yeah, I would say so. Because, I mean, if you are grown up in church at all, or you kind of tracking with us so far, it's Bible reading and prayer is going to be something that everyone's going to bring up. And then begrudgingly, there would be a lot of people to be like, yeah, fasting's probably one of those as well.
Right.
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 But when you say simplicity, it's like, what are we talking about with simplicity? Because that just does not have the same vibe
Right.
as the other ones, or something that's talked about as much as the other ones.
Absolutely. Well, I do have a definition for simplicity, which, as usual, you have all permission to shred to pieces, or create a new one. But what I have for a definition of simplicity is to live by your means and to eliminate excess for the purpose of keeping our focus on Jesus and his kingdom. And the example I would give of that with Jesus is that in the Gospels, it shows us that Jesus lived a simple life. He taught people to live simply. If you read through the Gospels, I think that will just it's really evident in the pages of how Jesus lived his life and how he taught people to live. And Jesus, knowing that he was going to spend his time traveling, he didn't even have any type of housing to call his own, for instance. And so that's another example of how he lived simply. I'm not telling you all to sell your houses. Okay, it's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But he just lived simply in that sense. He didn't have a need for that because he was traveling. Excuse me. And then Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 6 to not lay up or store up or accumulate, treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroys, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And also I'd point out that Paul taught in First Timothy that godliness with contentment is great gain. So I think a good way to kind of talk about simplicity, yes, a means to eliminate excess for the purpose of keeping our focus on Jesus and his kingdom, which has many layers to it, which Dustin is going to dive into here in just a moment. But I think a good word to discuss with that is this idea of contentment, and with our eyes on Jesus, would be another way to look at that. But Dustin, how would you define it, or does that work fairly well with what we're working with?
Yeah, I don't know if I would change it. There's a lot of ways you could say it,
Sure.
but I think that does give um, a good definition of the direction that we're trying to head with this conversation, because and there's a lot of layers to this. Um, Actually, what I want to do, because us talking about simplicity, talking about contentment, before I actually dive into your definition, I do want to like back up
Sure.
because everything we just described, there's a lot of people that may be putting two and two together, and they're like, oh, so we just need less stuff.
Right.
Or a big thing now is the term minimalism,
Right.
where it's just, you know, getting rid of some things or reorganizing or, um, that whole thing. And I would like to just kind of reel us back a little bit and say that what we're talking about is so much bigger than just an emphasis on your stuff.
Mm.
And so most when we're talking about simplicity and we're talking about contentment, I think that is the normal drift, and it rightly so, because we do have lots of stuff. Um, but what we're trying to talk about, it's bigger than that. It's greater than that. And your definition, if you could read it again, because I don't remember it word for word, but your definition encapsulates very well what we're actually meaning. So if you could read
Yeah,
that again.
absolutely. Simplicity is to live by your means and to eliminate excess for the purpose of keeping our focus on Jesus and his kingdom.
Right. And with that, if we are talking just about reorganizing our closet,
Mm-hmm,
if
mm-hmm.
we're just talking about kind of freeing up our schedules and our home and getting some stuff taken to Goodwill, or giving some things over to people, if there's no like reason beyond just getting rid of the thing, then that space is going to be filled up with something else, right?
Right. Yep.
So if your main focus and main priority of doing this is to just get rid of things, that space is going to be taken over by other things eventually, or other people. And so what we actually need to do is have something that we are simplifying around. That way we have that focus in mind. This is what we're simplifying for. This is the reason we are simplifying, is because of X. And that should be, as a Christian, simplifying our lives around Jesus, seeking to glorify him, seeking to bring him pleasure, seeking to become more like him. So in all of this, we have to start there. We have to start with simplifying um, around someone, which is Jesus. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yeah. It does. You have to have this centrality of it, this purpose of it. It's not simplicity for simplicity's sake, or
Right.
the idea of minimalism, right? It's kind of like, and maybe Dustin, this would be a good way to put it. It's like looking through a telescope, and when you do that, you actually have to limit your vision. You usually have to close like one eye, and then you have to adjust the focus. And so our focus point is Jesus.
Yeah.
And so we're saying, okay, I'm going to change this. I'm going to hone in here because now I can get a better view of who Jesus is. And I can,
Mm-hmm.
in light of that, be more like Jesus because this is what I see. And that can
Yeah.
permeate every aspect of our lives. Yeah. So I think that's really important to understand this focus, this simplicity, this it being Jesus.
Yeah. It, and I think to just kind of jump into the spot when we're talking about simplicity, I think I mentioned it the um, second episode, where we kind of walked through some of the disciplines and the track. I had mentioned that when we're talking about simplicity, there's three areas that we would focus on, and that would be simplicity of heart,
Hmm.
simplicity of, I don't know what exact word I use, but belongings or our stuff, that is part of it,
Mm-hmm.
and simplicity of pleasure. And the reason I do it in that order, it's with the heart is what we have to have first. If we have that simplicity of heart where we are focused around God, this is the reason we are simplifying, is what he wants is our main objective. And so that should inform everything else that we simplify and the reasons for it, right?
Right.
If and he has to be our sole focus. It's not what you we have so many verses about the heart, and out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. Where we lay up our treasures, there is our heart also. So like there's a lot of verses on our heart, who we are as a person. Who are we focusing on? What are we focusing on? We eventually become that thing. And so it's very important up front to understand when we are talking about simplicity, we are focusing on God, because when we do that, all of our attention, all of what we do is going to be towards that end and that purpose. And I don't know about you, number one, that's hard because my heart can be so divided. And it can be so many different things that I pursue or that I am trying to go after. And it's not bad things, but it's not the best thing. Whether that's money, which you kind of brought up, whether that's pursuing good things, that can cause our heart to be divided. And when we have a divided heart, it's going to be really hard to simplify.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of things pulling for our attention.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to bring that up, that's where we should start. And that's what we should focus on, is centering our life around God, simplifying things, and then we can start getting into the stuff that we have. We can start getting into, well, why am I simplifying here? It's because it should all point back to God. Yeah. I don't want to keep talking this, but I think it's just important to nail that point home.
Absolutely.
Because this is not a decluttering so you can just feel better.
Right.
Right. So
it's interesting, Dustin, because I think, and not to get totally sidetracked here, but there are certain things that we can do, or even within the practices, or even things beyond those, maybe things that we might have considered subdivisions of those things, or, we've talked about that, like, for instance, like physical activity or something that can help with other things. But it's interesting because some of the practices or some of the disciplines or some of the things that we can do that help us to be close to Jesus and to be like Jesus, there can be non-Christian versions of them.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what you're getting at there, is there are things that could in general be good for anybody, except they're leaving out the best part. They're leaving out
definitely
the good part. It's just like, okay, it might be beneficial, but you're leaving out Jesus. So for, an example would be there's non-Christian ways to do meditation.
Yes.
Right? Or to have silence and solitude. And that can be helpful and beneficial, but you're leaving out the best part.
Yeah.
Right? Same thing with community. Right. There's lots of different ways that you can find community. You can have your favorite watering hole, and that's going to be where you find community at. You can have your gym that you like to go to, and that would be your community. And those aren't intrinsically bad things, but community without Jesus is missing out on the best part of community.
Yeah.
So simplicity. Anybody can practice a certain level of simplicity. But when the purpose of it is to hone into a person, the person of
Yeah.
Jesus. Now that's something entirely different than
Right.
just decluttering or even simplifying your schedule, or simplifying your finances. If the
Right.
purpose of it, simplifying your heart, when Jesus is involved, it becomes something entirely different.
Yeah.
Same thing with fasting. There's like people for health reasons doing a fast, and there could be benefits to that. It's just missing the best part.
Right.
And that'd be kind of my way of phrasing that. So I think that would be helpful to kind of point it out that way.
Yeah. And I think, you know, when we look at it, we have to be very careful. Like and this is the reason it's one on the list, simplicity of heart. We have to get that right.
Yeah.
Because after that, your simplicity may look different than my simplicity.
Sure. Oh, absolutely.
Your
Yeah.
situation may look different than mine. And something that just comes to my brain is, team sports. There may be some people and some families who the way that they can focus on Jesus and be single-hearted and not divided is, well, we're just not going to be involved in team sports because it takes us away from too
Sure.
many things with church or whatnot.
Sure.
And then there are some people who practice this and they say, this is part of a rhythm of where we are around other people who are
Right.
far from Jesus. And we feel like God is calling us to do this. And part of us focusing on Jesus is being like him, being a light to other people. And we feel like that's what he's calling us to.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard once you get past this first step to then start pointing fingers and saying, well, that's not simple. That's not simple. Right. So I do want to point that out as we start to walk through this second and third
Yeah.
part, that
In other words, there's.
we're starting.
So
Yeah,
I was
go
going
ahead.
to say it's unique
Yeah.
to the individual or the family. I mean, is what you're getting at, right? Like
Yes.
there's a uniqueness to that.
Yeah.
That
And this is
you know,
this is part of the practice of it, is seeking God and saying, okay, if I'm glorifying you, if I'm bringing pleasure to you, and I'm trying to simplify my life, what are the things
right,
that I need to simplify in order to accomplish that? And
right,
it's going to be different for everybody because we're in all different places.
right.
So with that, simplicity of stuff, simplicity of belongings, simplicity of the things that we own. This is where some of the minimalism kicks in and is
Right.
a good thing. But
Right.
once again, we are being informed by the first.
I have a joke about that. I'll save for part two.
Oh,
Yeah,
tease.
like, and not like a knock knock joke. I like, it's something that we literally are experiencing as a family. Something that we did in regards to this part of simplicity that has come back to be really frustrating. But I'll tell. It's funny. I'll tell you about it.
Okay.
I'll tell you about it in part two.
All right. Tune in for part
Yeah.
2. Um, hopefully, I'm not setting you up for failure here. But in your
Oh boy.
opinion, and when you think about it, how does simplifying what we own and our belongings, how is that more than likely for us going to help simplify our lives, be able to help focus on the person of Jesus? Like,
Yeah.
how is this part of it?
Yeah.
Because once again, this is not just organizing things or decluttering for the sake of decluttering. We're doing this to have our sole focus on Jesus. So how does that actually work? How does A equal B?
Right. Right. And I think part of the answer to that applies in a broad sense, but for our purposes, it still makes sense. So the more possessions that you have, and it's not wrong to own things, But the more items that you have, the more time you will be spending with organizing those things or knowing what to do with those things,
Yeah.
or selling those things, or like we all have stuff, well, on various
Yeah.
levels, and so the more that you have, the more attention it requires. This is just a really practical thing, right?
Yeah.
If we're talking about the smallest things to the biggest things, right? Is I'll start with a simple idea, then go to an extreme idea. Is how many pens do you need? I mean, I have this whole like thing of pens, and most of them don't work, and I just have been lazy, haven't thrown them away because ink dried out or whatever. Okay, I actually just bought some new pens because I needed ones that worked.
Yeah.
But how many pens do you need? Because you're gonna have to spend time organizing those pens, figuring out which ones don't work at some point. Right? There's just
Yeah.
you could have like all this, and so there's this is one part of it. There's other aspects of it. There's one part of it is the more that you
Yeah.
own, the more that you're gonna have to do something with that stuff.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
On a bigger scale, the more vehicles that you own, the more oil changes that you're going to have to be doing, the more car upkeep that you have to do, that many more
Yeah.
car washings you have to do, whatever. Like I'm going to use like a small example, big example. Just the first point, as I'm saying, it's time consuming. The more stuff that you own, the more time you'll be spending doing something with that stuff. Once again, that's not intrinsically bad, but because it's time consuming, the more stuff that you have is it takes away from
Yeah.
time that you could be spending with Jesus. So that's just one simple aspect of that. This is a simple part of it
Yeah.
is that time aside, certain possessions that we have or excess of possessions that we have, besides it being a time issue, can be a more simple focus issue. The more items that you have, the more opportunity they have to steal our attention. Not that items can't steal our attention. Like, if you own a good book, I hope they can steal your attention and you read that book.
Yeah.
But the more that you possess, the more opportunity is for those items to capture your attention, or if you will, to capture your heart. It's like,
Yeah.
and so time, focus, these are things that the more that we have, the more we could potentially struggle with having the opportunities that we'd like to have to spend time with Jesus. So when we eliminate excess in our possessions, when we're just talking about the stuff that you own, if you just own if you live more closer to your means, then,
Yeah.
but I can afford that or I can get that, that's great. But if we live more within our means, it removes more distractions and it saves us more time. That would be
Yeah.
for the sake of spending more time with Jesus and being more focused on him. That would be
Yeah.
my spiel. I hope I didn't mess that
Yeah.
up.
No, we didn't even plan this, and that was like two of the three things I was going to mention.
Woo!
But I think I don't want to. I know you talked through it, but I don't want people to gloss over the importance of, and this will be something I want to kind of bring up as a practical tip in part two as well, but I'll just briefly mention it, is when you buy things, not only is there a monetary cost, there's a time cost
Yeah.
on all of it.
Yep.
And sure, maybe the time on a new pen is minimal, but we tend to not sit and daydream about things that we want, and there's pens, right? Normally it's bigger things or things that will take more time. And I work in insurance, so like I quite often helping people with vehicles, but the one thing I think of is motorcycle or a boat that people will go and buy. Not only do you have that cost up front, but it's going to take time to maintain. It's
Right.
going to take time for a bike to have the oil change. It's going to take time to go drive it, which means you have to make space for that. And so all of these all of these things are impacting our time. And so we have to realize that as we are buying things, there's a time cost as well. And if we have even less and less time in this world that we live in because of all the things that are distracting us, and we keep adding more things, what kind of time is left to kind of focus on God
Right.
and simplifying around God? So that's how I feel like this is tied into kind of the simplicity of heart. When we have that right, then we're saying, okay, this would be awesome to have, but it is not going to lead me to accomplish the primary focus because
Right.
it's going to take away from my time.
Right.
And there may be some people who they have an excess of time and they can fit that in and still
Right.
be an apprentice to Jesus and still learn and grow, and that's fine. But for some people, that it may not. And so
Right.
once again, that's why this is subjective. So you're right on the timepiece. I think that's great. Things can be distracting. I don't know about you. I'm sure there's a lot of people like this, but I've just got a lot of stuff all over the place. It drives me bananas, and I just cannot focus until everything is put where it needs to go.
Right. And that's focus and time combined at that point, right?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
the amount of time that I've spent reorganizing stuff,
Yeah.
it's one of those I call it a necessary evil. It's like you have this stuff, so it's got to go somewhere. It's got to make sense
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Exactly. I think one last thing that I would mention is with the way things work with advertisement and with our desires, the stuff that we purchase can lie to us,
Mm.
and
Oof.
we can find we I'll say it this way: when we make those buys, those impulse buys, we are trusting in that thing to provide security and to provide satisfaction.
Mm.
And if we're not careful, we are believing in something that cannot provide those things as opposed to finding that in God.
Hmm.
And so when we are not simplifying our belongings and we're just buying more and more things, we are practicing this discipline of looking for security, and we're looking for satisfaction in all the wrong places. And so I think that's something to bring up as well when we're talking about these. Because I know I've done it, and I'm sure everyone has done it. We think if I just have X,
Yeah.
then my life will be better.
Yep. Oh yeah. And marketing these days is next level too. And that's what
Yeah.
most marketing does. Most marketing is saying if you have this item, then you'll be satisfied.
Yes.
You'll be content after you get this item.
Yes.
That's the same way like entertainment works too. It's if I watch this show, then I'll feel fulfilled. If I watch then I'll feel whatever. And once again, we're not saying that you can't buy stuff. We're not saying you can't watch
Right.
content. But if we don't have a simple mindset and a focused mindset on Jesus, we can start believing the lies that these other things will give us what only Jesus can.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I like how you said that. I like the simplicity of the statement you said a moment ago, which was sometimes the stuff we buy lies to us. Something like that is what you said.
Yeah.
And I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's true. I mean, like you said, marketing, it is next level. I
Mm-hmm.
mean,
Yep.
you're not going to be happy unless you have this, and then everyone loves you.
Yeah. It's
Right?
just like magic.
It's awful. How much there is a lie of we need this in order to be
Yeah.
happy, or we need this to be satisfied, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not true. We do need to learn contentment. And once again, Not that you can't buy stuff, but if it's for those reasons, then it's probably not a good reason to buy.
Yeah. Yep.
Where are
Absolutely.
we at on time? I have not been paying attention.
We're right at 30 minutes. So,
All right. What I would like to do, maybe touch on, and maybe we can kind of do a little more on part two, but we're also talking simplicity of pleasures. And the verse that comes to mind is the verse in Galatians talking about not being drunk with wine. KJV, wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. And so, this idea of simplicity of pleasure is that we tend to, especially nowadays, we tend to excess on a lot of pleasures, a lot of things in this world, whether that's simple things like food or drink, but we can also find, these pleasures of going on all of these trips and these vacations and
right.
travel, which is not bad, but we tend to go in excess of these pleasures, right? And we tend to leave no space for God because we are pursuing these pleasures in life, which can kind of go hand in hand with the being lied to. But we feel like if we have more of X, then we'll be happy and satisfied, and that kind of is tied into the pleasure aspect. If we just have this great steak at this steakhouse, it's going to be an amazing meal, and I'm going to be satisfied.
Yeah.
Yeah, for like 6 hours,
Yeah.
and then you're hungry again.
You're right.
Right. Um, don't know who our audience is, so I'll be careful. But out here in Portland, everyone drinks, so
Right. Right.
it's like, man, if you have this X wine that was dated back in the 1800s, like, right? But that's only a momentary pleasure and it's gone.
Right.
And
Right.
we tend to not, we can enjoy those things that God created, but we should not go in excess.
Right.
We should live simply in those pleasures. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think I'd like to, this one last thing I'd like to add, Dustin, unless there's anything else you wanted to add, is that from experience, I know that in these areas of my life, when I'm living my simplest, I'm the most focused on Jesus. That is when I am the most content.
Mm.
So the reason I'm saying that is, there's a journey aspect with this. So it's not like, okay, well, once I get focused and then I'll live simpler.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, as you journey through this simplicity as a means of being with Jesus and being like Jesus, the more that you practice simplicity, the more content you will become.
Yeah.
And the more pleasure in Jesus that you will find. So
Yeah.
that's what I'd share in my experience, because when my life becomes less simple, it's harder to focus on Jesus and the less content that I become. So that would be my 2 cents personally on what that looks like in my
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
Anything else before we wrap this up and head over to part 2?
No, I don't think so. I think it would be good, if you finish this, to hop over to part 2. I do have some. I'm sure you would too, but I've got some practical things
Yep.
that maybe we could kind of focus on when we're talking about simplicity. So yeah, head on over there.
Cool. Well, if this has been an encouragement to you, please subscribe, like, share with others that you might think that would be a blessing to you. And also comment below if you have any questions about what we talked about today, if you have any concerns about what Dustin said today.
Exactly.
If it wasn't helpful, write in the comments why it wasn't helpful. But otherwise, head over to part 2 as we continue to talk in a practical way and share a bit about what simplicity has or hasn't looked like in our lives. So see you over there.
See you there.